I'm Edward, and I'm glad we can share this peaceful moment together. Tonight, a warm greeting to our listeners in Kansas. I'd love to know where are you listening from, and which person from your past you still carry often in your thoughts. Please subscribe if you enjoy these cozy mysteries. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Day the Village Stood in Order. The news had come on a Tuesday morning quietly and without fuss, which was perhaps fitting for a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that St. Mary Mead remained undisturbed by unpleasantness. Geoffrey Haydock had died in his sleep at the age of 73, and by Wednesday afternoon the entire village knew precisely where they were expected to be on Friday at 2 o'clock. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her drawing-room window with a piece of knitting that advanced very slowly indeed, had observed the progression of the news with the mild interest of one who has seen many such progressions before. Mrs. Dingle from the post office had been the first to spread the word, her black coat already brushed and ready by the time she knocked on Miss Marple's door at 9:30. The grocer's boy had carried it to the outlying cottages by noon. By tea time, the arrangements were settled with a precision that would have done credit to a military campaign. The village, Miss Marple reflected, was very good at funerals. It knew its place in such matters, quite literally. The old families would sit near the front, the tradespeople in the middle rows, the newer residents toward the back. The doctor's housekeeper, Mrs. Denning, would occupy a position of honour despite her station, for service of 30 years carried its own distinction. The vicar would speak with appropriate gravity. The flowers would be white and dignified. Everything would proceed exactly as it ought. It was this very orderliness that had begun in some quiet corner of Miss Marple's mind to seem peculiar. She had known Dr. Haydock, of course. One could not live in St. Mary Mead for as many years as she had without knowing the doctor rather well indeed. He had attended her through influenza, seen to her nephew Raymond during a childhood visit that had ended with a sprained ankle, and called upon her dear friend Mrs. Bantry when she had suffered that unfortunate incident with the tainted salmon. He had been calm, reassuring, and thoroughly competent. He had never caused alarm, never suggested difficulties where there were none, never made a patient feel foolish for consulting him. The village had trusted him absolutely. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed out at the high street, where the morning sunlight fell pleasantly across the familiar shops and cottages. It was early autumn, and the leaves were just beginning to turn. The air held that curious quality of change disguised as constancy of things shifting beneath a surface that appeared perfectly still. She thought of Dr. Haydock's face, ruddy and good-humoured, his manner always faintly jovial in that particular way doctors sometimes adopted when they wished to put nervous patients at ease. She thought of his voice, deep and confident, pronouncing diagnoses with a certainty that discouraged questions. She thought of how grateful people had been to have a doctor who made everything seem manageable, who transformed worry into relief with a few well-chosen words and a prescription written in his firm, illegible hand. And she thought, with the uncomfortable clarity that sometimes visited her at unexpected moments, of how very convenient it must be to have authority that was never questioned. The funeral service was to be held at St. Mary's Church, naturally, with burial in the churchyard where Dr. Haydock's wife had been laid to rest some 15 years earlier. The Reverend Clement had been preparing his remarks with unusual care, for Dr. Haydock had been a pillar of the community, a man whose steady presence had shaped the village's sense of itself. There would be a reception afterward at the village hall, organised by the Ladies' Guild with their customary efficiency. Sandwiches, tea, and perhaps a glass of sherry for those who required fortification. Miss Marple had received 3 separate visits from members of the guild, each confirming that she would, of course, attend, and each subtly ensuring that she understood the importance of showing proper respect. She had agreed with perfect courtesy, for she had no intention of being anywhere else. Funerals, she had long ago discovered, were occasions when people revealed themselves with unusual clarity. Grief stripped away certain social defences. Tribute required careful choices about what to say and what to omit, and guilt, when present, often emerged in the smallest gestures and the most innocent phrases. She was not entirely certain why she suspected there might be guilt. On Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village shop to collect a few necessities and found Mrs. Cavendish, the bank manager's wife, discussing the funeral arrangements with Mrs. Price, who kept the draper's shop and considered herself an authority on matters of etiquette. Of course the man was a saint, Mrs. Cavendish was saying, her voice carrying the particular firmness of someone determined to establish a fact before it could be questioned. An absolute saint. Always so patient, so understanding. My husband says we shall never see his like again. Mrs. Price nodded vigorously. Never a cross word, never an impatient moment, and so wise about not making difficulties where none existed. Do you remember when young Tommy Henderson came running to him with that ridiculous story about seeing spots? Haydock knew at once it was nothing serious, told the boy not to worry himself and sent him home. Turned out to be perfectly right, of course. He had a gift for knowing what mattered and what didn't, Mrs. Cavendish agreed. Some doctors make such a fuss about every little thing. Dr. Haydock understood that half the time people simply needed to be told they were perfectly well and to stop imagining troubles. Miss Marple, selecting a tin of biscuits with apparent absorption, listened with the gentle attention of an elderly lady who happened to be nearby. She did not interrupt, she rarely did. People she had found said a great deal more when they believed they were not being particularly attended to. I suppose, Mrs. Price said, lowering her voice slightly, we shall have Dr. Morris taking over the practice now. He's been assisting for the past year or so. A very different sort of man, Mrs. Cavendish said, and that there was something in her tone that suggested this difference was not entirely to be welcomed. Rather inclined to suggest further examinations, specialists even, as though we couldn't trust a perfectly competent village doctor to know his own business. Modern ideas, Mrs. Price said with faint disapproval. Dr. Haydock understood that most ailments cure themselves given time and common sense. No need to go making people anxious with talk of consultants and tests. Miss Marple paid for her biscuits and walked home slowly, thinking about young Tommy Henderson and his spots. She seemed to recall that the boy had been quite ill some weeks after Dr. Haydock had pronounced him well. Measles, wasn't it? Or had it been scarlet fever? In any case, he had recovered, which was the important thing, though his mother had seemed rather worn and anxious for some time afterward, and had made several urgent trips to the surgery before Dr. Haydock had finally prescribed something effective. But then, Mrs. Henderson was inclined to worry. Everyone said so. Dr. Haydock had been quite right to discourage her from fussing over every small symptom. That evening Miss Marple sat in her drawing room as light faded, her knitting once again providing a gentle occupation for her hands while her mind moved along its own quiet paths. She thought about authority and how it was established. She thought about trust and how it could become something rather different from confidence when it discouraged people from asking questions. She thought about the particular comfort of being told that one's worries were groundless, and how much easier it was to accept reassurance than to persist in doubt. She thought about all the times Dr. Haydock had been right, which were many, and about the curious fact that no one seemed inclined to mention the times he might have been wrong. The village would gather tomorrow to honour a man it trusted implicitly. The service would be dignified and the tribute sincere. Dr. Haydock's 40 years of service would be properly recognised, his dedication to the village duly celebrated. Everything would be conducted with precision and good taste, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the most important observations were often made at occasions when everyone else's attention was focused elsewhere, would be watching and listening with the quiet attention that had served her so well over the years. For there was something about this funeral, she reflected, that reminded her of the time in her youth when the village of Much Benham had gathered to mourn old Colonel Arthurston, who had been universally beloved until 3 months after his burial, when certain financial irregularities had come reluctantly to light. The Colonel had not been dishonest precisely. He had simply been very good at making people feel that asking questions demonstrated a lack of faith in his judgment. Dr. Haydock, she thought, had also been very good at making people feel that asking questions was unnecessary. Tomorrow she would see who grieved and who merely attended. She would listen to what was said and, perhaps more importantly, to what was carefully left unsaid. She would notice who seemed comfortable with the tributes being offered, and who looked faintly troubled by the perfection of the portrait being painted. For Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that when a village worked too hard to remember someone in exactly the right way, it often meant there were other memories that were being very carefully forgotten. She set aside her knitting, rose to draw the curtains against the gathering darkness, and prepared herself for what promised to be a most instructive funeral indeed. Chapter 2. A Funeral Conducted with Precision. Friday arrived with the sort of mild, overcast weather that seemed designed by Providence for solemn occasions. The sky hung low and grey above St. Mary Mead, not threatening rain but suggesting the possibility with sufficient force to make black umbrellas a sensible precaution. By 1:30, the High Street had acquired the particular quality of quietness that descends upon a village when everyone is preparing for the same event at the same time. Miss Marple, dressed in her black coat and a hat of dignified simplicity, walked to the church at 20 minutes to 2. She had timed her departure with care, arriving early enough to observe others as they gathered, but not so early as to seem over-eager. The art of observation, she had long ago discovered, required being present yet unobtrusive, noticed yet not particularly attended to. The churchyard was already beginning to fill. People stood in small groups, speaking in lowered voices, their faces arranged in expressions of appropriate gravity. Miss Marple recognised nearly everyone, which was hardly surprising. St. Mary Mead was not a large village, and Dr. Haydock had attended most of its inhabitants at one time or another over his 4 decades of practice. Colonel Bantry stood near the church entrance, his military bearing evident even in grief, discussing something in quiet tones with Major Westbury. Their wives hovered nearby, Mrs. Bantry resplendent in black silk, Mrs. Westbury in a more modest woolen suit that nonetheless conveyed proper respect. Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Bantry looked genuinely distressed, her handkerchief already deployed against tears that threatened to overflow. Mrs. Westbury, by contrast, appeared composed to the point of rigidity, her expression suggesting duty rather than sorrow. Young Dr. Morris stood somewhat apart from the main groups, his thin face solemn and his shoulders slightly hunched as though he felt the weight of stepping into a role that had been occupied by someone infinitely more established. He was a conscientious young man, Miss Marple thought, but lacking into Haydock's gift for inspiring immediate confidence. He tended to explain too much where Dr. Haydock had pronounced with finality. He suggested possibilities where Haydock had offered certainties. The village, she suspected, found this quality unsettling. Mrs. Denning, the late doctor's housekeeper, arrived in a motor car driven by her nephew. She was a stout woman of perhaps 55, dressed in deepest black, her face swollen from recent weeping. She had kept Dr. Haydock's house with devoted efficiency for 30 years, managing his domestic life with the same quiet competence he had brought to managing the health of the village. There was something almost ceremonial in the way she was escorted into the church, people stepping aside with murmured condolences, acknowledging her particular claim to grief. Miss Marple found her usual pew and settled herself with the small adjustments of posture that elderly ladies require. From this position she had an excellent view of the congregation as it assembled, and she watched with the gentle interest of one who finds humanity endlessly instructive. The church filled steadily. The Prices from the draper's shop, the Cavendishes from the bank, old Mrs. Harmon, who had been confined to her cottage for years with rheumatism, but had somehow managed to make the journey today, the grocer Mr. Smedley and his sharp-featured wife, the postmistress Mrs. Dingle, still wearing her black coat from Wednesday, young Tommy Henderson with his mother, the boy looking healthy enough now, whatever his earlier troubles had been. And there, arriving with her customary quietness, was Mrs. Edith Crowley. Miss Marple observed her with particular attention. Mrs. Crowley was a widow of modest means who lived in one of the smaller cottages on the edge of the village. She was perhaps 60, a thin woman with greying hair and a face that might once have been pretty, but had been worn into something more austere by time and, Miss Marple suspected, disappointment. She dressed neatly but without style, moved unobtrusively through village life, and rarely drew attention to herself. She had a married daughter in Bournemouth whom she visited twice yearly, and she spent her days in the quiet occupations of gentle poverty. a little sewing for those who required it, some assistance at church functions, careful economy in all things. She slipped into a pew near the back, her expression carefully neutral, and folded her gloved hands in her lap with a precision that seemed almost defensive. The church bell tolled the hour, its deep notes carrying across the village with solemn authority. The congregation settled into expectant silence. The vicar, the Reverend Leonard Clement, entered from the vestry, his face composed in lines of dignified sorrow. He was a youngish man, perhaps 40, who had come to St. Mary Mead only 5 years earlier, and still retained something of the earnestness of the recently ordained. He had admired Haydock immensely, Miss Marple knew, and had often consulted him on matters of parishioners' welfare. The service began with the familiar words, their rhythm as comforting as they were ancient. The congregation rose and sat and knelt with practised precision. Hymns were sung with appropriate solemnity. The prayers were read with feeling but without excessive emotion. And then the Reverend Clement began his eulogy. He spoke of Dr. Haydock's 40 years of service, his dedication to the village, his unfailing availability in times of need. He described a man of steady temperament and sound judgment, a physician who had brought comfort and healing to countless families. His voice, naturally rather light, deepened with conviction as he enumerated the virtues of the deceased. Dr. Haydock, the vicar said, was a man who understood that medicine was not merely a science but an art. The art of reassurance, the art of bringing peace to troubled minds. How many of us have sat in his surgery, burdened with worry, and left feeling that our concerns, which had seemed so overwhelming, were in fact quite manageable? How many have been grateful for his calm certainty, his ability to see past our anxieties to the simple truth beneath? Miss Marple, listening with every appearance of respectful attention, thought that this was precisely the difficulty. She did not doubt the sincerity of the vicar's words, nor the truth that many people had indeed felt reassured by Dr. Haydock's manner. But she found herself wondering whether being made to feel that one's concerns were manageable was quite the same thing as having those concerns properly addressed. He never caused alarm where none was warranted, the Reverend Clement continued. He understood that fear itself can be more harmful than many ailments, and he had the gift of perspective that allowed him to distinguish between genuine danger and needless worry. In an age increasingly prone to nervousness and excessive concern about health, Dr. Haydock represented steadiness and common sense. The congregation murmured its agreement. Heads nodded gently. Mrs. Bantry dabbed at her eyes. Colonel Bantry sat very straight, his jaw set in the particular way men of his generation adopted when confronting emotion. He was never one to suggest difficulties where none existed, the vicar said, never one to recommend unnecessary treatments or to speak of complications that might never arise. He trusted in the body's natural wisdom, in rest and time and sensible living. How refreshing in our modern world of specialists and consultants to have had a doctor who believed in simplicity and trust. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had she brought them, would have moved very slowly indeed at this moment. She sat perfectly still, her face serene, but her mind was remarkably active. Trust, she reflected, was a curious thing. It could be earned through competence and proven through results. But it could also be established through confidence, through the appearance of certainty, through the simple fact of never admitting doubt. And once established, trust had a remarkable way of discouraging questions. The eulogy continued. The vicar spoke of Dr. Haydock's kindness, his patience, his willingness to call upon patients in all weathers and at all hours. He mentioned the doctor's love for his late wife, his fondness for fishing, his quiet presence at village functions. He painted a portrait of a man who had been, in every respect, exactly what a village doctor should be. What he did not mention, Miss Marple noticed, was anything that might complicate this portrait. No mention of cases that had been difficult, of diagnoses that had required revision, of times when Dr. Haydock's reassuring certainty might have been premature. No acknowledgement that even the best physicians sometimes err, that medicine is an uncertain art, that trust should never entirely replace vigilance, The omissions, she thought, were as revealing as the statements. When the vicar finished speaking, there was a moment of profound silence, and then Colonel Bantry rose to offer a few words on behalf of the village. He spoke briefly and with military precision, expressing gratitude for Dr. Haydock's service, and noting that the village had been fortunate indeed to have had such a man watching over its health for so many years. "He made us feel safe," the colonel said simply, and sat down. Miss Marple glanced around the church. Most faces reflected agreement, comfort, and appropriate sorrow. But there were others, Mrs. Crowley's among them, whose expression suggested something more complex. Not disagreement precisely, not even doubt, but rather a kind of careful blankness, as though they had learned that certain thoughts were best kept private. The service concluded with a final hymn and a blessing. The congregation filed out slowly, following the coffin as it was carried to the prepared grave. The burial was conducted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized the entire proceeding. Words were spoken, earth was scattered, and Dr. Geoffrey Haydock was laid to rest beside his wife beneath the ancient yew tree that had witnessed so many similar ceremonies. As the mourners began to drift toward the village hall for the reception, Miss Marple remained for a moment at the graveside, ostensibly adjusting her gloves, but in fact observing who lingered and who hurried away, who wept, and who seemed merely thoughtful. The funeral, she reflected, had been conducted with precision. Every word had been carefully chosen, every gesture appropriate, every tribute sincere. Dr. Haydock had been honoured exactly as the village wished to honour him, and that, Miss Marple thought as she turned to make her way to the reception, was precisely what troubled her most of all. Chapter 3. Please, Curth that left things out. The village hall had been prepared with the thoroughness that the Ladies' Guild brought to all such occasions. White tablecloths covered the long tables, tea urns steamed gently at one end of the room, and plates of sandwiches sat in neat rows alongside modest arrangements of biscuits and small cakes. Everything spoke of respect without extravagance. Mourning tempered by the understanding that life must continue and people must be fed. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Miss Hartnell, who presided over the urn with the authority of one who had performed this service at countless village functions. Miss Hartnell was a large, energetic woman of indeterminate age, who involved herself in every aspect of village life and considered it her duty to ensure that everyone knew everyone else's business, though she would have phrased it rather differently. "Such a beautiful service," Miss Hartnell declared, her voice carrying across the immediate vicinity with the penetrating quality that made private conversation in her presence nearly impossible. The vicar spoke so well. Of course, he could hardly have done otherwise. Dr. Haydock was such a remarkable man. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, accepting her tea with a gentle smile. "I was just saying to Mrs. Price," Miss Hartnell continued, gesturing toward the draper's wife who stood nearby, "that we shall never find another doctor quite like him. Young Dr. Morris is all very well, I'm sure, but he hasn't the same steadiness, has he? Always suggesting one ought to see specialists or have further examinations, as though Dr. Haydock's opinion weren't perfectly sufficient." Mrs. Price joined them, balancing a cup of tea and a small plate with 2 sandwiches. Dr. Haydock understood that most troubles resolve themselves given time, she agreed. He never made one feel foolish for consulting him, but neither did he encourage unnecessary worry. A very balanced approach. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Around the hall, similar conversations were taking place in small clusters. The dominant theme, she observed, was gratitude for Dr. Haydock's particular manner of practice, his ability to dismiss concerns with confident reassurance, his preference for simple remedies over complicated investigations, his talent for making patients feel that their fears were groundless and their faith in him entirely justified. Colonel Bantry's voice rose above the general murmur. He stood near the far window with Major Westbury and the Mr. Cavendish from the bank, and his military training gave his pronouncements an air of finality that discouraged contradiction. "The man never lost his head," the colonel was saying. "That's what I admired most. Never panicked, never dramatized a situation. When my wife had that scare about her heart 2 years ago, Dr. Haydock examined her thoroughly and told us straight away there was nothing to worry about. Said it was nerves and prescribed a tonic. He was absolutely right, of course. Dolly's been perfectly well ever since. Joe Westbury nodded vigorously. Sound judgment. That's the key to good medicine. My old regimental doctor was the same way. Understood that half the battle was keeping morale up. Can't have people thinking they're invalids when they're nothing of the sort. Mr. Claudius Cavendish, a precise man who dealt in figures and facts, adjusted his spectacles and added his own observation. Dr. Haydock saved the village a great deal of unnecessary expense over the years. Other doctors might have sent people off to consultants at the drop of a hat, running up bills that would bankrupt ordinary families. Dr. Haydock knew when something was serious and when it was merely nerves or imagination, a practical man in every sense. Miss Marple's attention shifted to a group of women seated near the tea table. Mrs. Henderson, young Tommy's mother, was speaking in low tones to Mrs. Smedley, the grocer's wife. Neither woman looked entirely comfortable, though both were appropriate expressions of sympathy. Of course one must respect his judgment, Mrs. Henderson was saying, her voice carrying a curious flatness. He was the doctor, after all. One can hardly question someone with 40 years of experience. Mrs. Smedley stirred her tea with unnecessary vigour. Quite though I must say, when my youngest had that cough last winter, and Dr. Haydock said it would pass on its own, I did feel rather, well, one worries, doesn't one? But he was right in the end. These things do pass. After 6 weeks, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. Well, yes, but it did pass as he said it would. Miss Marple moved slowly around the room, her teacup providing both occupation and excuse for her perambulations. She paused here and there, listening more than speaking, observing with the gentle attention that people rarely noticed because it seemed so innocent of purpose. Mrs. Denning, the housekeeper, sat in a chair by the wall, surrounded by well-wishers offering condolences. Her grief appeared genuine and profound, her eyes red-rimmed, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. Miss Marple approached and expressed her own sympathies with quiet sincerity. 30 years I kept his house, Mrs. Denning said, her voice thick with emotion. 30 years and never a crossword between us. He was the kindest of men, Miss Marple, so thoughtful, so considerate. He trusted me completely, you know. Let me manage everything domestic so he could focus on his patients. He used to say I was indispensable. I'm sure you were, Miss Marple said gently. It must have been a great comfort to him, having someone so devoted. He deserved devotion, Mrs. Denning said firmly. A man who gave so much to others. Do you know, he never once complained about being called out in the middle of the night. Never showed impatience, even with people who fretted over trifles. He had such faith in the body's ability to heal itself. Nature knows best, Mrs. Denning, he used to say. Our job is simply not to interfere unnecessarily. Miss Marple made a small sound of understanding and moved on, leaving Mrs. Denning to the ministrations of the next wave of sympathisers. Near the window she encountered the Reverend Clement, who appeared somewhat drained from the emotional weight of the service. He held a cup of tea but had not touched it. His attention focused on the middle distance in the way of those still processing recent events. A difficult duty, Vicar, Miss Marple observed gently. He started slightly, then managed a wan smile. Indeed, Miss Marple, though also a privilege. Dr. Haydock was a man worthy of the finest eulogy, and I fear mine fell short of his merits. You spoke very well, Miss Marple assured him. You captured his particular gifts admirably. His ability to bring peace to troubled minds, the vicar said, warming to his theme. That was perhaps his greatest talent in our anxious age, with people increasingly prey to nervous ailments and imaginary sufferings. Dr. Haydock represented calm certainty. He never encouraged the kind of introspection that can become morbid. No, Miss Marple agreed. He was certainly not one to encourage excessive concern. Precisely. I've often thought that modern medicine, with all its advances, sometimes forgets that the mind and body are connected. Dr. Haydock understood that telling someone their symptoms were serious could make them worse through worry alone. Better to reassure, to encourage natural healing, to avoid planting seeds of anxiety. Miss Marple considered this philosophy with her head tilted slightly, a posture that suggested receptive agreement while committing to nothing. "And if the symptoms prove to be serious after all?" she asked mildly. The vicar looked momentarily uncertain. Well, naturally, if something truly required intervention, he would have noticed. His experience was vast. One must trust in that experience. "Of course," Miss Marple said, "trust is essential." She moved away, her progress slow and seemingly aimless, though in fact she had noticed Mrs. Edith Crowley standing quite alone near the door, as though preparing to make an early exit. The widow held an untouched cup of tea and wore an expression of studied politeness that suggested she was present out of obligation rather than desire. Before Miss Marple could make her way to Mrs. Crowley's side, however, Miss Hartnell's voice rang out again, this time addressing the room at large. "I think we should all be grateful," Miss Hartnell announced, "that Dr. Haydock never believed in alarming people unnecessarily. Some doctors seem to think their duty is to find problems where none exist. Dr. Haydock understood that most of us are perfectly healthy and simply need to be told so firmly." There was a general murmur of agreement. Mrs. Bantry, recovered somewhat from her earlier tears, nodded emphatically. "He told me on more than one occasion that I was perfectly sound and simply needed to stop reading medical articles that put ideas in my head. He was quite right. I felt much better once I stopped worrying." "The power of the mind over the body," Major Westbury proclaimed. "Modern medicine forgets its peril." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Crowley during this exchange. The widow's face remained carefully neutral, but her fingers tightened slightly on her teacup, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested a kind of weary resignation, as though she had heard all this before and knew better than to voice disagreement. A moment later, Mrs. Crowley set down her cup with quiet deliberation and slipped toward the door. She moved with the practiced unobtrusiveness of someone accustomed to leaving rooms without being noticed, and indeed, most of the mourners were too engaged in their own conversations to mark her departure. Miss Marple, however, noticed. She noticed, particularly, that Mrs. Henderson watched the widow go with an expression that might have been understanding or might have been relief that someone else had chosen to leave early. The gathering continued for another hour, tributes flowing as freely as the tea, each speaker adding to the portrait of Dr. Haydock as a paragon of medical virtue. No one mentioned mistakes. No one spoke of times when his reassurances might have proven premature. No one questioned whether confidence and competence were always synonymous. The praise, Miss Marple reflected as she finally made her own departure, had been generous and sincere, but it had also been remarkably selective. What made a portrait convincing was not merely what it included, but what it carefully, perhaps unconsciously, chose to omit. And in this portrait of Dr. Geoffrey Haydock, there were curious blank spaces where a more complete picture might have shown shadows alongside light, uncertainty alongside confidence, and the simple human fallibility that accompanies even the best intentions. The question, Miss Marple thought as she walked home through the quiet afternoon, was whether those omissions were merely the kindness of mourning, or whether they represented something more troubling, a collective determination not to remember what might disturb the comfortable certainty the village had built around a man they had trusted absolutely. She suspected it was the latter, and she suspected too that Mrs. Crowley might have her own reasons for leaving early, reasons that had very little to do with grief and a great deal to do with memories that did not fit the approved narrative. Chapter 4. Grief expressed unevenly. The weekend following the funeral passed with the particular quietness that descends upon a village after a significant event has concluded. The church service and reception had provided a focus for collective emotion, and now that they were over, people returned to their ordinary routines with a sense of duty discharged and proper respect demonstrated. Life, as it must, continued. Miss Marple spent Saturday morning in her garden, though the mild autumn weather was beginning to give way to something cooler. The roses needed deadheading, and there was a border that required attention before winter arrived in earnest. Gardening had always provided her with an opportunity for reflection, the physical occupation leaving her mind free to consider matters that might otherwise have remained obscure. She thought about Mrs. Crowley's early departure from the reception, and about the brief expression on Mrs. Henderson's face as she watched the widow leave. She thought about the unanimity of praise for Dr. Haydock, and about the small silences that had punctuated that praise. Brief hesitations, careful phrasings, thoughts redirected before they could be fully articulated. On Saturday afternoon, Miss Hartnell appeared at her gate, ostensibly to admire the chrysanthemums, but clearly animated by something more pressing than horticultural appreciation. "Miss Marple, I simply had to tell someone," Miss Hartnell began, her voice vibrating with the particular energy of one who has discovered information of social significance. "I've just come from the post office, and Mrs. Dingle was saying that Mrs. Crowley has been behaving most oddly." Miss Marple straightened from her weeding, her expression one of mild interest. "Oddly, Miss Hartnell? Well, you noticed she left the reception quite early, didn't you? Barely stayed half an hour. Mrs. Dingle says she seemed almost anxious to get away, as though being there distressed her. And then yesterday, when Mrs. Price tried to speak with her in the village, Mrs. Crowley was quite short, almost rude, Mrs. Price said, though of course Mrs. Price is too kind to use that word herself." "Perhaps Mrs. Crowley was unwell," Miss Marple suggested gently. Miss Hartnell waved this possibility away with a gloved hand. "Mrs. Dingle thinks it's more than that. She says Mrs. Crowley has always been rather oversensitive, inclined to take things to heart, you know. The sort of person who imagines slights where none are intended, and exaggerates every small ailment into a major crisis." "I see," Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced by this characterization. "The thing is," Miss Hartnell continued, lowering her voice despite the absence of anyone else within earshot, "one does wonder if her manner at the funeral wasn't a touch disrespectful. After all, de Haydock was nothing but kind to her over the years. She consulted him frequently, you know. Some might say excessively, and he was always patient with her, even when her complaints proved to be nothing serious." Miss Marple resumed her weeding, her movements slow and methodical. "How trying that must have been for Dr. Haydock," she murmured. "Exactly so. And now, when the rest of us are honouring his memory and acknowledging all he did for the village, Mrs. Crowley can't even manage to stay for a proper period at the reception. It seems rather ungrateful, doesn't it?" After Miss Hartnell had departed, her need for an audience satisfied, Miss Marple remained in her garden for some time. The late afternoon sun slanted across the flower beds, casting long shadows, and somewhere a blackbird sang its evening song. The world appeared peaceful and ordered, as it so often did on the surface, but Miss Marple was thinking about the speed with which Mrs. Crowley's behaviour had been interpreted and judged. Oversensitive, inclined to exaggerate, ungrateful, these were labels that, once applied, became difficult to remove. They served a useful purpose, she reflected, in that they allowed people to dismiss someone without having to consider whether that person might have legitimate reasons for their conduct. She had observed this pattern many times before in many different contexts. It was remarkable how swiftly a village could reach consensus about someone's character, particularly when that consensus allowed everyone else to feel comfortable about their own assumptions. On Sunday morning, Miss Marple attended the church service and found the congregation noticeably smaller than usual. The emotional expenditure of Friday's funeral had apparently exhausted people's capacity for piety, at least temporarily. She noted that Mrs. Crowley was not present, which was unusual, as the widow generally attended services with faithful regularity. After the service, as people gathered in small groups outside the church, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Mrs. Bantry, whose grief for Dr. Haydock had evolved into a kind of wistful reminiscence. "I've been thinking so much about all the times he helped us," Mrs. Bantry said, her handkerchief once again at the ready, though not yet required. "Do you remember when Arthur had that terrible scare about his blood pressure? Dr. Haydock examined him and said there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He was so reassuring. Arthur felt better immediately." "I'm glad the Colonel recovered," Miss Marple said. Oh well, there was nothing to recover from, you see. That was Dr. Haydock's point. Arthur had simply been overexerting himself at golf and needed to moderate his exercise. No cause for alarm whatsoever. Dr. Haydock understood that men of Arthur's generation don't like to be treated as invalids. Miss Marple made a small sound of understanding. And the Colonel has been well since? Perfectly well. Though I do sometimes wonder. Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then seemed to think better of continuing that thought. Well, in any case, Dr. Haydock's judgment was sound, as always. Miss Marple waited, but Mrs. Bantry had apparently exhausted whatever uncertainty had briefly surfaced. Instead, she changed the subject to the upcoming church bazaar, and Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift in that direction, while storing away the incomplete sentence for later consideration. On Monday afternoon, Miss Marple decided to call upon Mrs. Crowley. It was the sort of visit that required no special excuse in a village where elderly ladies of similar circumstances might reasonably be expected to take tea together occasionally. She had not been to Mrs. Crowley's cottage in some months, and the proprieties suggested that a visit was overdue. The cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, somewhat removed from the main part of the village. It was a modest dwelling, well maintained but showing the kind of careful economy that spoke of limited means. The small front garden was neat, though its flowers were past their best, and lace curtains hung in the windows with the particular crispness that suggested they were taken down and washed with regularity. Mrs. Crowley answered the door with an expression that momentarily revealed surprise before settling into polite welcome. She was dressed simply in a grey cardigan and dark skirt, her hair pulled back in a style that was practical rather than fashionable. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Please do come in." The cottage's interior was as neat as its exterior, furnished with pieces that suggested an earlier period of greater prosperity now long past. Everything was spotlessly clean, arranged with precision, and somehow rather lonely, as though the rooms were maintained more from habit than from any expectation of regular use or visitors. They settled in the small sitting room with tea that Mrs. Crowley prepared with careful attention to the proper ceremony. The china was good quality, but old-fashioned, the tea strong, the biscuits plain but fresh. For several minutes they observed the rituals of polite conversation, remarks about the weather, acknowledgement of the season's change, brief commentary on village matters. Then Miss Marple said gently, "I noticed you left the reception rather early on Friday. I do hope you are not unwell." Mrs. Crowley's cup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. "No, not unwell. I simply felt that I had paid my respects and there seemed no reason to remain." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "These occasions can be rather taxing." "Yes." Mrs. Crowley looked down at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. "Though I confess I find it difficult when people speak with such absolute certainty about matters that are, well, that perhaps deserve more consideration than they receive." Miss Marple waited, her own hands occupied with her teacup, her expression one of sympathetic attention. "Dr. Haydock was very well liked," Mrs. Crowley continued slowly, as though each word required careful selection. "I would not wish to speak ill of him. He was kind to me in his way, always patient when I came to him with concerns, always ready with reassurance." "But," Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Crowley looked up, and in her eyes was something that might have been relief at finding someone willing to listen without immediate contradiction. "Reassurance is not always the same as careful attention, is it? And patience with what one considers needless worry is not quite the same as taking that worry seriously enough to investigate its source." "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "It is not the same at all." "I have been told," Mrs. Crowley said, her voice steady despite a slight tremor that suggested suppressed emotion, "that I am oversensitive, that I imagine troubles, that I exaggerate symptoms and create difficulties where none exist. I've been told this so often that I almost came to believe it myself." She paused, reaching for her teacup and then abandoning the gesture. "But you see, Miss Marple, I was right to be concerned. It took seeing Dr. Morris after Dr. Haydock's death to discover that. The discomfort I had mentioned so many times, the symptoms I had described, the worries I had expressed, they were not imagination after all. They were real, and they had been real for quite some time. Miss Marple set down her own cup very carefully. "I see. Do you?" Mrs. Crowley asked, and there was a desperate quality to the question. "Because I am not certain anyone else does. Or perhaps they simply prefer not to see. It is easier, I suppose, to believe that I was merely being difficult, that Dr. Haydock was right to tell me I was perfectly well and needed only to stop fretting." "What did Morris discover?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Crowley told her, speaking quietly but with gathering conviction, describing symptoms that had persisted for years, consultations that had ended with reassurance rather than investigation, a condition that had been allowed to progress because a trusted physician had been so very certain there was nothing to concern oneself about. "I am not dying," Mrs. Crowley concluded. "Dr. Morris assures me the treatment now will be effective, though it would have been simpler had things been addressed earlier. But you see, I learned to distrust my own judgment. Dr. Haydock was so confident, so experienced. Who was I to question him? A widow of modest means, with a tendency to worry over much. That is how he saw me, I think. How the village sees me still." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her face thoughtful. Then she said, "I think, Mrs. Crowley, that the village may need to reconsider certain assumptions it has made, not only about you, but about the nature of trust and the dangers of certainty that discourages questions." Mrs. Crowley looked at her with something approaching hope. "You believe me, then?" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe that grief is expressed unevenly, because people grieve for different things. Some mourn the loss of a good man, others mourn the cost of having trusted too completely and questioned too little. Both forms of grief are entirely valid, though only one is currently being acknowledged." For the first time since Miss Marple's arrival, Mrs. Crowley's carefully maintained composure wavered, and tears gathered in her eyes. But they were, Miss Marple thought, tears of relief rather than sorrow, the relief of finally being heard. Chapter 5, A Reputation Too Carefully Guarded. The discovery that Mrs. Crowley's concerns had been legitimate rather than imagined occupied Miss Marple's thoughts considerably over the following days. It was not that she suspected Haydock of deliberate negligence. She had lived long enough to understand that mistakes in judgment were part of the human condition, and medicine was an uncertain art, even under the best circumstances. What troubled her was the pattern that seemed to be emerging, a pattern of reassurance offered so confidently that it discouraged further inquiry, of authority so well established that questioning it seemed not merely impertinent but somehow disloyal. On Tuesday morning she encountered Mrs. Henderson in the greengrocer's shop. The grocer's wife was serving and her husband was in the back preparing an order for delivery, which meant the shop had that particular atmosphere of semi-privacy that encouraged confidences. Mrs. Henderson was selecting vegetables with the careful attention of someone managing a household budget, and Miss Marple, ostensibly examining the apples, found herself drawn into conversation. "Your son is looking well," Miss Marple observed. "The measles seem to have left no lasting effects." Mrs. Henderson's hands stilled over the carrots. "Scarlet fever, actually," she said quietly, "though Dr. Haydock initially told me it was nothing to be concerned about. Just spots," he said. "Children get them, no cause for alarm." "But you sought further advice," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Eventually, after Tommy's fever worsened despite Dr. Haydock's reassurances that it would pass, I was made to feel rather foolish for worrying, you understand? Dr. Haydock was very kind about it, but he did say that mothers often work themselves into states over perfectly ordinary childhood complaints. He advised me to be calmer, to trust in nature's course." Mrs. Smedley, the grocer's wife, had paused in her work and was listening with apparent interest. "My youngest had something similar," she offered. "That persistent cough I mentioned at the funeral reception. Dr. Haydock told me it would resolve itself, that giving it too much attention would only make the child anxious. He said modern mothers had a tendency to fuss." "And did it resolve itself?" Miss Marple asked. After some weeks, yes, though I confess I spent several sleepless nights wondering if I should seek another opinion. But one feels so disloyal, doesn't one? As though questioning the doctor's judgment is a kind of betrayal of trust. Miss Marple selected 3 apples with care. I wonder, she said thoughtfully, whether to Haydock advise discretion as a general principle, or whether there were particular cases where he felt publicity would be, shall we say, unhelpful? The 2 younger women exchanged glances. Mrs. Henderson spoke first, her voice dropping to a level that would not carry to the back of the shop. I did hear, she said carefully, that when Mrs. Jameson had her trouble last year, Dr. Haydock advised her very strongly not to discuss it. Said it was the sort of thing that would only cause unnecessary concern in the village if word got about. Better to keep it private, he told her. These matters were best handled quietly. And was it handled quietly? Miss Marple inquired. Oh, yes. Mrs. Jameson followed his advice completely, told no one, sought no second opinion, bore it all with admirable stoicism, exactly as he recommended. And the outcome? Mrs. Henderson's expression grew troubled. She recovered, after a fashion, though she's never been quite the same since, rather withdrawn, one might say, but then she was always a private person. Miss Marple paid for her apples and walked home slowly, her basket on her arm and her thoughts moving along paths that grew increasingly clear. She was beginning to understand that Dr. Haydock's reputation, that carefully maintained image of calm, competence and reassuring certainty, had been preserved not merely by his medical skill, but by a systematic discouragement of discussion, comparison or doubt. It was, she reflected, a very effective way to prevent uncomfortable questions. If patients were told that their symptoms were not serious enough to mention, that discussing their concerns would alarm others unnecessarily, that seeking further opinions demonstrated a lack of faith in their doctor's judgment, then naturally those patients would remain silent. And in their silence, any errors of judgment would remain undiscovered, any oversights uncorrected. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from the Reverend Clement. He appeared somewhat agitated, and accepted her offer of tea with distracted gratitude. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple, he began, settling himself in her sitting room with obvious discomfort. I find myself in need of perspective, and you have always struck me as possessing an uncommonly balanced view of human nature. You're very kind, Vicar, Miss Marple said, pouring tea with steady hands. How may I help? It's a matter of some delicacy, he said, accepting his cup. I've had several visits this week from parishioners who seem troubled by certain memories relating to Dr. Haydock. Not willing to speak ill of the dead, you understand, but nonetheless carrying what I can only describe as unresolved concerns. I see, Miss Marple said encouragingly. Mrs. Bantry came to see me yesterday. She wanted to discuss her husband's health scare from 2 years ago, the blood pressure incident I mentioned in my eulogy. It seems the Colonel has been having some recurring symptoms lately, and the new Dr. de Morris has suggested that perhaps the earlier diagnosis was incomplete, that further investigation might have been warranted at the time. The vicar set down his cup and rubbed his forehead wearily. Mrs. Bantry is caught between loyalty to Dr. Haydock's memory and concern for her husband's present health. She asked me whether it would be wrong to suggest that Dr. Haydock might have been mistaken, whether voicing such a thought would be disrespectful to his service. And what did you tell her? Miss Marple asked. I told her that the truth is never truly disrespectful, though I'm not certain I entirely believe that myself. The thing is, Miss Marple, de Haydock specifically advised the Colonel not to seek a specialist's opinion. Said it would be a waste of time and money, that village doctors understood their patients better than London specialists, who saw them for 10 minutes and charged outrageous fees. The Colonel trusted that judgment completely. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Did de Haydock often discourage consultations with specialists? Now that you mention it, yes. I remember him saying to me once that half the problems in modern medicine came from people running off to consultants who knew nothing about their patients' constitutions or habits. He believed strongly in the value of long-term knowledge of a patient, in understanding their family history and temperament. He felt that this knowledge gave him insights that a specialist could never possess. There is certainly truth in that, Miss Marple observed, though I wonder whether such knowledge might occasionally become an obstacle rather than an advantage. If one believes one already knows everything relevant about a patient, one might be less inclined to look for new information. The vicar looked at her with something approaching relief. That's precisely what I've been thinking, though I felt disloyal for thinking it. Dr. Haydock was so confident in his judgments, so certain of his understanding, and the village rewarded that certainty with absolute trust. We wanted to believe that someone knew definitively what was wrong and what was right. Doubt is uncomfortable, you see. Uncertainty requires us to take responsibility for our own decisions. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. It is much easier to defer to authority than to maintain one's own judgment. And Dr. Haydock made such deference very easy indeed. He removed the burden of uncertainty from his patients by being so thoroughly certain himself. But what if that certainty was sometimes misplaced? The vicar asked. Then, Miss Marple said, those who trusted him would have suffered for their trust, not through any malice on his part, but through the simple fact that he was human and therefore fallible, yet had constructed a reputation that made acknowledging fallibility impossible, both for himself and for others. The Reverend Clement sat in silence for a moment. I'm beginning to think, he said finally, that my eulogy was rather incomplete. I praised Dr. Haydock's ability to bring peace to troubled minds, but I said nothing about whether that peace was always warranted, whether certainty was always appropriate, whether discouraging questions was truly in his patient's best interests. You praised what the village wished to remember, Miss Marple said gently. That is what eulogies do. But perhaps the time has come to remember other things as well. Not with bitterness or accusation, but with honesty. Dr. Haydock's reputation has been too carefully guarded, Vicar. And in guarding it so carefully, the village may have prevented itself from learning lessons that might benefit those who are still living. The vicar departed some time later, looking thoughtful rather than troubled. Miss Marple watched him walk down the path and reflected that truth, once it began to emerge, had a curious way of gathering momentum. What had started as her own quiet observations was now becoming a matter of wider consideration. The village was beginning to remember what it had preferred to forget, to question what it had accepted without examination. The difficulty, she thought, would be in ensuring that this examination served the living rather than merely disturbing the peace of the dead. Sir Haydock could not be held accountable now for his errors of judgment, but the village could learn to be more careful about conferring absolute trust, about accepting reassurance without scrutiny, about allowing reputation to shield reality from proper attention. It was a lesson that might prove uncomfortable. But then, Miss Marple had long ago learned that the most valuable lessons usually were. Chapter 6. The Inconvenient Memories of the Ordinary. Wednesday brought rain, the sort of steady drizzle that turned the village grey and encouraged people to remain indoors with fires lit and curtains drawn against the gloom. Miss Marple spent the morning reading, though she found her attention wandering from the page to the window, where raindrops traced uncertain paths down the glass. She had been thinking about Mrs. Crowley, about the widow's careful account of years spent doubting her own perceptions, because a trusted authority had assured her those perceptions were faulty. It was a familiar pattern, one Miss Marple had observed in various forms throughout her long life. People of modest station, particularly women, were taught from earliest childhood that deference was a virtue and persistence in one's own views a kind of vulgarity. Respectability, Miss Marple reflected, had many costs that were rarely acknowledged. In the afternoon, the rain eased sufficiently for a visit, and Miss Marple found herself once again walking towards Mrs. Crowley's cottage. She had not announced her intention to call, but between elderly ladies of similar circumstances such formality was unnecessary. A visit might be prompted by nothing more than the desire for companionship on a dreary day. Mrs. Crowley received her with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, though there was also a wariness in her expression, as though she feared that Miss Marple's previous sympathy might have been temporary. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Miss Marple said once they were settled with tea. and I wondered if you might tell me more about your consultations with Dr. Haydock. Not the medical details themselves, which are your private concern, but rather the manner in which those consultations were conducted." Mrs. Crowley's cup trembled slightly. "You truly wish to know?" "I do. I believe your experience may illuminate something that the village needs to understand." Mrs. Crowley set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap with the particular precision that suggested an effort to maintain composure. "It began perhaps 5 years ago," she said slowly. "A persistent discomfort, nothing dramatic, but persistent enough to concern me. I consulted Dr. Haydock, naturally. He was the village doctor, and I trusted him as everyone did." "And what did he tell you?" "He examined me briefly and said it was nothing serious. Likely digestive troubles brought on by nervousness. He asked about my circumstances. I had recently lost my sister, with whom I had been very close, and suggested that my symptoms were a manifestation of grief, that the body sometimes expressed what the mind could not accept." Miss Marple nodded. "There is certainly truth in such observations." "Oh yes, I'm sure there is, and at the time I was grateful for the explanation. It made sense, you see. I was grieving, I was alone, I was adjusting to changed circumstances. Of course my body would react to such stress. Dr. Haydock prescribed a tonic and advised me to keep myself occupied. He said I should avoid dwelling on these sensations, as such dwelling only made them worse." "But the symptoms persisted," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes. I returned to him several months later, apologetically, explaining that the discomfort had not resolved as he had predicted. He seemed not annoyed precisely, but perhaps mildly disappointed in me. He said that these things took time, that I must be patient, that continuing to focus on minor symptoms was a form of self-indulgence that would prevent natural healing." Mrs. Crowley's voice had grown very quiet. "He was kind when he said it, you understand. He smiled. He patted my hand. He told me I was too intelligent a woman to fall into the trap of hypochondria, that I should trust his experience and stop worrying myself into illness." "You consulted him again?" Miss Marple prompted. "Several times over the following years. Each visit followed much the same pattern. I would describe my symptoms, apologizing for taking his time. He would remind me that he had already examined me thoroughly, that further examinations were unnecessary, that I was allowing anxiety to create problems where none existed. He suggested that perhaps I should find more activities to occupy my mind. He recommended that I not discuss my health with others, as such discussions only reinforced unhealthy preoccupations." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "So you suffered in silence?" "Yes, because he was the doctor, and I was merely a nervous widow with too much time to dwell on imaginary ailments. That is what I learned to believe about myself, Miss Marple, that my perceptions were unreliable, that trusting my own judgment was a form of foolishness, that the correct course was to accept what I was told and stop being troublesome." "You feared seeming troublesome?" Miss Marple observed. "I feared it desperately. Dr. Haydock had been so patient with me, so generous with his time despite my repeated visits about what he clearly considered trivial concerns. I felt I owed him gratitude, not further imposition. And the village values stoicism, doesn't it? Endurance without complaint. I did not wish to be the sort of person who made a fuss." Mrs. Crowley reached for her handkerchief, though her eyes remained dry. "When the symptoms worsened, I told myself it was my own fault for not following Dr. Haydock's advice properly. When I had difficult nights, I reminded myself that he had said these troubles were largely mental. When I felt desperate for another opinion, I suppressed that desire as disloyalty to a man who had given 40 years of service to the village. Until Dr. Haydock died," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes, until then, I would never have consulted another doctor. It would have seemed an insult to his judgment, a public declaration that I knew better than he did. But after his death, when Dr. Morris took over the practice, I thought perhaps I might mention my ongoing concerns, not as a criticism of Dr. Haydock, you understand. but simply as information for the new physician. And Dr. Morris investigated properly. He did. He asked detailed questions. He arranged examinations that Haydock had never suggested. He told me that my symptoms warranted attention, that they were not imaginary, that I had been right to be concerned all along. Mrs. Crowley's voice wavered. Do you know what that meant to me, Miss Marple? To be told that I had been right to trust my own judgment? That I was not foolish or oversensitive or troublesome? Miss Marple set down her cup. My dear Mrs. Crowley, I wonder if you realise how familiar your experience is, not in the specific medical details which are your own, but in the pattern. The authority figure who is so certain, the ordinary person who learns to doubt her perceptions, the gratitude, that becomes a trap, preventing legitimate concern from being voiced. You've seen this before? Many times in many contexts. The trusted servant who steals because the employer cannot imagine doubting someone so long in their service. The respected clergyman whose advice goes unquestioned even when it leads people astray. The teacher who silences students with superior knowledge that proves to be incomplete. Authority, once established, creates its own protection. Those who hold it need not be deliberately malicious. They need only be confident enough to discourage challenge. Mrs. Crowley looked at her with something approaching wonder. Then you don't think I was wrong to have trusted him? Not at all. You trusted as the village trusted, as we're all taught to trust those who hold positions of responsibility and expertise. The error was not in the trusting, but in the assumption that such trust should be absolute and unwavering. Haydock encouraged that assumption, whether consciously or not, by responding to legitimate concerns as though they were character flaws requiring correction. He made me ashamed of my own body's signals, Mrs. Crowley said slowly, as though this realization was just becoming clear. Ashamed of needing reassurance, ashamed of wanting thorough investigation, ashamed of not being the sort of patient who simply accepted what she was told and went away cured by confidence alone. Yes, Miss Marple said, and in doing so he prevented you from seeking help when you needed it most, not through cruelty, I think, but through an excess of certainty combined with an intolerance for doubt, either his own or anyone else's. They sat in silence for several moments, the rain having resumed its gentle percussion against the windows. Finally, Mrs. Crowley spoke again, her voice stronger than before. I have been wondering whether I should speak of this more widely, whether others might have similar experiences that they've been too ashamed to mention. But I fear how the village would respond. They loved Haydock, they trusted him. I would be seen as vindictive, as someone speaking ill of the dead out of spite or attention-seeking. Perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, or perhaps the village is more ready to hear such truths than you imagine. I have noticed certain stirrings of reconsideration, certain questions being asked that were not asked before. The ground, shall we say, is being prepared. By you? Mrs. Crowley asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I merely observe and, when appropriate, facilitate. The truth will emerge regardless of my involvement. The question is whether it emerges gently, as a lesson for the living, or harshly, as an indictment of the dead. I prefer the former when possible. What should I do? Continue to live honestly, Miss Marple said simply. Answer truthfully when asked. Do not volunteer accusations, but do not suppress facts out of misplaced loyalty. And remember, my dear, that respectability which requires you to doubt yourself before doubting others is not true respectability at all. It is merely a convenient fiction that protects the powerful and silences the ordinary. When Miss Marple left the cottage some time later, the rain had stopped and a weak sun was attempting to break through the clouds. She walked home slowly, thinking about all the Mrs. Crowleys she had known over the years, people whose ordinary observations and reasonable concerns had been dismissed because they lacked authority, because they were too deferential, because they had been taught that their own judgment was inherently suspect. The village, she reflected, had many lessons to learn, and Mrs. Crowley's inconvenient memories might prove to be the beginning of a necessary education. Chapter 7. What had been signed without question. Thursday morning brought clearer skies and a crispness to the air that suggested autumn was settling into its latter phase. Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor shortly after breakfast, young Dr. Morris, who appeared at her door with an expression that mingled professional composure with evident discomfort. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time," he began, his thin face anxious. "I find myself in need of advice, and Mrs. Bantry suggested you might be willing to listen." Miss Marple showed him into the sitting room and offered tea, which he accepted with the gratitude of someone who had been awake since early morning worrying about a difficult matter. "I've been going through Dr. Haydock's records," Dr. Morris explained once they were settled. "It's standard practice when taking over a medical practice. One needs to understand patients' histories, ongoing treatments, past diagnoses. I expected it to be straightforward, merely a matter of familiarizing myself with cases I'll now be managing." He paused, stirring his tea with unnecessary concentration. "Instead, I've discovered several instances where Dr. Haydock's conclusions seem to have been, how shall I put this, rather more confident than the evidence perhaps warranted." "Mrs. Crowley's case among them?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Sir Morris looked up sharply. "You know about that?" "Mrs. Crowley mentioned that you had found her concerns to be legitimate after all. I gathered that Dr. Haydock had dismissed them as nervousness." "Yes, exactly so. But it's not only Mrs. Crowley, there are others, not many perhaps, but enough to form a pattern. Cases where symptoms were certified as minor when they might have benefited from further investigation. Diagnoses recorded with absolute certainty that later developments have called into question." He set down his cup, clearly troubled. "I want to be clear, Miss Marple. I'm not suggesting Dr. Haydock was incompetent. His knowledge was extensive, his experience vast, but there seems to have been a tendency to close cases decisively, to provide reassuring conclusions rather than acknowledge uncertainty. And once those conclusions were recorded in his confident hand, they became facts that no one questioned." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Can you give me an example? Without violating confidentiality, of course." "Well, there's Colonel Bantry's case. Dr. Haydock certified 2 years ago that the Colonel's blood pressure concerns were simply the result of overexertion and anxiety. He prescribed rest and moderation. The records contain no indication that Dr. Haydock considered any other possibilities or recommended further examination." "But you have since discovered otherwise?" "Mrs. Bantry asked me to see the Colonel last week, after he experienced recurring symptoms. A proper examination revealed a condition that should have been investigated at the time. Not urgently dangerous, you understand, but something that would have been better addressed earlier. The Colonel is receiving appropriate treatment now, but there has been unnecessary delay." "Domzo," and Morris leaned forward, his earnestness evident. "The difficulty is that Dr. Haydock's original certification was so definitive. He wrote that he had examined the Colonel thoroughly and found nothing requiring concern. That declaration became part of the permanent record. When Mrs. Bantry mentioned her husband's symptoms to friends, they all assured her that Dr. Haydock had already ruled out anything serious. His authority closed the matter." "Authority often does," Miss Marple observed. "Indeed. And there are other cases. Mrs. Jameson, for instance. Dr. Haydock treated her last year for what he certified as a temporary digestive complaint requiring rest and simple dietary changes. He specifically noted in his records that no further intervention was necessary. Mrs. Jameson followed his advice precisely and did not seek additional consultation because his certainty seemed to preclude any need for it." "And the outcome?" "She recovered, as many patients do regardless of treatment. But the recovery took far longer than it should have, and she suffered considerably during that time. When I reviewed her case recently, she came to me about an unrelated matter. It became clear that a different approach at the outset might have shortened her difficulties substantially." Miss Marple poured more tea, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "You said there were several such cases." At least 5 that I've identified thus far, and I've only reviewed perhaps a third of the records. All follow similar patterns: confident diagnoses, reassuring certifications, specific notations that further examination was unnecessary, and advice to avoid discussing the matter with others as that would only cause needless anxiety. That last point is particularly interesting, Miss Marple said. Medical privacy is one thing, but active discouragement of discussion seems to serve another purpose entirely. Yes, I thought so too. It prevented patients from comparing experiences, from discovering that others might have received similar reassurances that proved premature. It isolated them, made each feel that their case was unique and that questioning Dr. Haydock's judgment would be inappropriate. Der Source, sir. Morris stood and walked to the window, his back to Miss Marple. The terrible thing is that there was no malice in any of this. His notes are meticulous, his handwriting steady, his tone consistently reassuring. He believed he was helping his patients by sparing them unnecessary worry. He was convinced that his experience gave him insights that made further investigation redundant. Confidence can be a dangerous thing, Miss Marple said quietly, particularly when it removes the need for scrutiny. Once Dr. Haydock had certified something as fact, who would dare to question it? He was the trusted village doctor, the man with 40 years of experience. To doubt him would seem not merely impertinent, but somehow ungrateful. Exactly so. And the patients themselves were complicit in this, though not deliberately. They wanted to believe him. They wanted to trust that someone knew definitively what was wrong and what was right. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, as the vicar said to me yesterday. Dr. Haydock removed that discomfort by being so thoroughly certain about everything. Dr. Morris returned to his chair, his expression troubled. My question to you, Miss Marple, is what ought I to do with this information? I cannot simply ignore it. That would be a dereliction of my duty to current patients, but neither can I publicly criticize a dead man who cannot defend himself. The village revered Haydock. They trusted him completely. If I suggest that trust was sometimes misplaced, I risk being seen as a young upstart trying to enhance my own reputation by diminishing his. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on her teacup. I think, she said finally, that you must do what is best for your living patients without concerning yourself overmuch with the reputation of the dead. Dr. Haydock's memory will not be served by continuing patterns that may have caused harm, nor will the village benefit from maintaining illusions that prevent necessary learning. But how do I accomplish this without causing distress? By being honest when asked, circumspect when not. If patients inquire about previous diagnoses, you tell them the truth as you understand it. If they seek to compare your approach with Dr. Haydock's, you explain that medical practice evolves and that different physicians may reach different conclusions from the same evidence. You need not attack his methods to justify your own. Morris nodded slowly. And if people ask directly whether Dr. Haydock made errors, then you acknowledge that all physicians make errors because medicine is not an exact science, and human judgment is always imperfect. What matters is not whether mistakes were made. They certainly were, as they are in every medical practice, but whether those mistakes were compounded by certainty that prevented correction. That's precisely what troubles me most, Morris said. The mistakes themselves I can understand and forgive, but the systematic discouragement of second opinions, the confident certifications that closed off further inquiry, the advice to patients not to discuss their cases with others, these things transformed ordinary errors into something more problematic. They created a situation where Haydock's authority protected itself rather than his patients. Miss Marple inclined her head. You understand the matter clearly, Doctor. The question now is how the village can come to understand it as well, without bitterness or recrimination, but with sufficient clarity to prevent such patterns from recurring. You think it will recur? It will if the village learns the wrong lesson. If people simply conclude that Dr. Haydock was uniquely flawed, they will transfer their absolute trust to the next authority figure and repeat the same pattern. But if they learn that trust should always be tempered with appropriate vigilance, that confidence is not the same as infallibility, and that asking questions is not disloyalty but prudence, then something valuable may come from this painful examination. Dr. Morris stood to take his leave, looking somewhat less burdened than when he had arrived. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've helped me see my way forward more clearly." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time in her chair, watching the late morning light angle through the window. She thought about signatures on medical certificates, about words written with confident authority that became unquestionable facts. She thought about how easy it was for certainty to masquerade as competence, and how difficult it was to challenge authority once it had been established. Dr. Haydock had signed numerous documents over his 40 years of practice. Each signature had carried the weight of his experience, the force of his confidence, the assurance of his judgment, and because he had been so certain, because his certifications had been so definitive, no one had thought to question what had been signed. The village, Miss Marple reflected, had accepted those signatures as gospel truth, and in doing so it had absolved itself of the responsibility to think critically, to ask questions, to maintain appropriate skepticism, even toward trusted authorities. It was a lesson the village very much needed to learn, and she suspected the learning would prove uncomfortable for everyone involved, herself included. Chapter 8. The Cost of Being Reassuring. By Friday, the weather had turned properly cold, and Miss Marple found herself spending more time indoors, her knitting progressing at its usual measured pace while her thoughts moved considerably faster. The various conversations of the past week had begun to coalesce into a clearer understanding, and she found herself reconsidering not only Dr. Haydock's actions, but the village's relationship with him. What had seemed at first glance to be a simple case of medical errors now appeared as something more complex, a symbiotic arrangement between a doctor who valued certainty above scrutiny and a community that preferred comfort to vigilance. Both parties had benefited from this arrangement, at least superficially. Dr. Haydock had maintained his reputation as the ideal village doctor, never causing alarm, always inspiring confidence. The villagers had enjoyed the pleasant fiction that someone knew exactly what was wrong with them and could be trusted absolutely to make everything right. But there had been costs, Miss Marple reflected, and those costs had been borne by people who could least afford them. She was interrupted in these reflections by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who swept into the sitting room with the energy of someone who has made an important decision and wishes to share it immediately. "Jane, I must tell you something that I've been thinking about all week," Mrs. Bantry announced, settling herself without waiting for invitation. "It's about Arthur and his health, but really it's about Haydock and the way we all behave toward him." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Do go on, Dolly." "I've been remembering the incident 2 years ago, when Arthur had those symptoms that worried me so terribly. Do you recall? I was quite frightened, actually, though I tried not to show it. Arthur was having pains in his chest, difficulty breathing after exertion, moments of dizziness. I was convinced something was seriously wrong." "I remember you were concerned," Miss Marple said. "Dr. Haydock came to see him that very afternoon. He examined Arthur thoroughly, or so I thought at the time, and then he told us both, in that wonderfully reassuring way he had, that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He said Arthur had simply been overdoing things, that men of his age needed to moderate their activities, and that the symptoms would resolve with rest and common sense." Mrs. Bantry paused, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. "I was so grateful, Jane, so enormously relieved. Dr. Haydock made it all seem so simple, so manageable. He told me I was being a sensible wife to call him, but that I mustn't let worry run away with me. He said anxiety could make symptoms worse, and that the best medicine was confidence in the body's natural resilience." "And Colonel Bantry followed his advice?" "Oh yes, religiously. We both did. Arthur moderated his golf, rested more, and the acute symptoms did subside. Not entirely, but enough that we felt Dr. Haydock had been right. We were so grateful to him for sparing us unnecessary alarm." Mrs. Bantry looked directly at Miss Marple, her eyes troubled. But now Dr. Morris has examined Arthur properly, and it turns out there was something to worry about after all. Not immediately life-threatening, thank heavens, but something that should have been addressed 2 years ago. If it had been, Arthur would have been spared considerable discomfort, and I would have been spared 2 years of intermittent worry that I kept telling myself was foolish. Dr. Haydock's reassurance was premature, Miss Marple observed gently. Yes, but the terrible thing, Jane, is that I wanted to be reassured. I wanted to believe that everything was simple and manageable. When Haydock told me not to worry, I was so relieved that I didn't think to ask whether he had considered all possibilities. I didn't ask about further tests or specialist consultations because I was afraid such questions would make me seem neurotic or untrusting. Mrs. Bantry's voice grew more urgent. And when Arthur's symptoms didn't entirely disappear, I told myself that some discomfort was natural at his age. I suppressed my own observations because Haydock had been so certain. I chose comfort over accuracy, and I encouraged Arthur to do the same. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. Dr. Haydock's greatest virtue, as the village saw it, was his ability to make people feel comfortable. But comfort and truth are not always compatible, are they? No, they're not. And I've been thinking about all the times over the years when Dr. Haydock made things comfortable for us, when he assured me that various symptoms were nothing to worry about, when he told Arthur that he was being overcautious, when he discouraged us from seeking second opinions by suggesting such things were unnecessary expenses for nervous people. Mrs. Bantry twisted her handkerchief. He was so good at it, you see, making us feel that we were being sensible by trusting him, that we were showing good judgment by accepting his reassurances without question. He never said we were foolish for worrying, but he made it clear that continuing to worry after he had pronounced everything well would be foolish. A subtle distinction, Miss Marple said. Yes, very subtle, and effective, because we wanted to appear sensible and trusting and not the sort of people who made difficulties out of nothing. So we accepted what he told us and felt grateful for his patience with our concerns. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her needles moving with their usual rhythm. I have been pondering, she said slowly, the difference between harm caused by intention and harm caused by omission. Dr. Haydock did not, I think, set out to injure anyone. He believed he was serving his patients well by sparing them unnecessary anxiety. He prided himself on his ability to distinguish between genuine problems and imaginary ones. But he was wrong sometimes, Mrs. Bantry said. Yes, and when he was wrong, his very confidence prevented correction. Because he had made his pronouncements so definitively, and because the village had learned to accept those pronouncements without question, mistakes were allowed to persist. Patients suffered quietly, blaming themselves for continued symptoms rather than questioning whether the diagnosis might have been incomplete. Like Mrs. Crowley, Mrs. Bantry said quietly. Miss Marple looked up with interest. You've heard about Mrs. Crowley's case? Dr. Morris mentioned it to Arthur, very discreetly, when explaining why he wanted to review Arthur's earlier year diagnosis. He said there had been several instances where Haydock's reassurances had proven premature, and that he wanted to ensure nothing had been overlooked in Arthur's case. Mrs. Bantry's face showed genuine distress. I've been thinking about Mrs. Crowley, about how we all dismissed her as oversensitive and inclined to imagine troubles. We said she was the sort of person who couldn't accept reassurance, who persisted in complaining even after Dr. Haydock had told her nothing was wrong. We thought her persistence was a character flaw. When in fact it was entirely justified, Miss Marple said. Yes, and I made her feel foolish for not accepting Dr. Haydock's judgment. We reinforced his message that she was creating problems through excessive worry. We were complicit in silencing her legitimate concerns because it was easier to trust the doctor than to consider that she might be right and he might be wrong. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at Mrs. Bantry with compassion. You're being very honest with yourself, Dolly. That cannot be comfortable. It isn't. But it's necessary, isn't it? If we're to learn anything from this, we must be honest about our own role in creating a situation where Dr. Haydock's authority couldn't be questioned. We made him infallible by refusing to consider that he might err. We participated in building a system where being reassured was more important than being accurately informed." "Why do you think the village did that?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bantry considered this carefully. "Because uncertainty is frightening. Because we wanted someone to know definitively what was wrong and how to fix it. Because trusting an authority figure absolutely is easier than maintaining our own judgment and accepting responsibility for our own decisions. Dr. Haydock offered us certainty, and we were so grateful for it that we didn't examine whether that certainty was warranted. And when his certainty proved misplaced, we blamed the patients rather than questioning the doctor. We said they were oversensitive or didn't follow instructions properly, or were simply unlucky. We did everything possible to preserve our faith in his infallibility, because admitting he might be wrong would force us to accept that we might be wrong to trust him so completely." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The cost of being reassuring," she said quietly, "is that those who provide reassurance may stop examining whether that reassurance is deserved, and those who receive it may stop asking questions that would disturb their comfort. Dr. Haydock's greatest virtue became over time something rather less virtuous, not through malice but through the gradual erosion of appropriate caution on both sides." "What do we do now?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "We acknowledge the truth," Miss Marple said simply. "We recognise that Dr. Haydock served the village for 40 years with dedication and genuine care for his patients, but we also recognise that his dedication did not make him infallible, and that our gratitude should not have prevented us from maintaining appropriate vigilance. Those who suffered through his omissions, Mrs. Crowley, your husband, Mrs. Jameson, and others, were not, and harmed by his intention, but by his excessive confidence combined with our excessive trust. Will the village understand that distinction? Some will, others will resist, because it requires admitting their own complicity. But the truth, once acknowledged, has a way of spreading. And perhaps in time St. Mary Mead will learn to balance trust with appropriate questioning, to accept reassurance without surrendering judgment, and to understand that the best doctors are not those who make us most comfortable, but those who take our concerns most seriously." Mrs. Bantry stood to leave, looking somehow lighter, despite the gravity of their conversation. "Thank you, Jane. I came here feeling guilty and confused, and I leave feeling that perhaps there's a way forward that honours both Dr. Haydock's service and the truth about its limitations." After she had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind remained on the question of costs. De Haydock had paid no cost for his errors. He had died respected and mourned, his reputation intact. The village had paid no cost either, having enjoyed years of comfortable certainty. Only the patients had paid in suffering that might have been prevented, in doubts about their own judgment, in delays that had allowed conditions to worsen. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire matter. Chapter 9, Miss Marple speaks after the service. Sunday morning arrived with pale sunshine and a hint of frost on the ground, the kind of weather that made the walk to church bracing but not unpleasant. Miss Marple dressed with particular care, choosing her good coat and a hat of dignified simplicity. She sensed that today's service might prove significant, though in what precise way she could not yet determine. The church was fuller than it had been the previous Sunday, as though the village had collectively decided that a period of reflection following Dr. Haydock's funeral had been sufficient and normal attendance should resume. Miss Marple took her customary pew and observed the gathering congregation with her usual quiet attention. Mrs. Crowley was present, she noted with approval, sitting toward the back but with a posture that suggested more composure than anxiety. Mrs. Bantry and the Colonel occupied their usual prominent position, both looking rather more thoughtful than usual. Dr. Morris sat near the side, his young face serious but no longer quite so burdened. Various other villagers filed in, the Prices, the Cavendishes, Mrs. Henderson with young Tommy, Miss Hartnell in her usual commanding position. The service proceeded through its familiar rhythms. The Reverend Clement's sermon that morning touched upon the theme of truth and compassion, and Miss Marple suspected his choice of topic was not accidental. He spoke of the difficulty of balancing honesty with kindness, of the temptation to offer comfort, even when truth might prove more valuable in the end. "We are called," the vicar said, his light voice gaining strength with conviction, "to speak the truth in love, not truth wielded as weapon, nor love that requires we suppress uncomfortable realities, but truth offered gently, with compassion for human weakness and understanding of our shared fallibility." Miss Marple observed several members of the congregation shifting in their seats, and she suspected they recognised that the sermon was about more than abstract theological principles. After the service concluded, the Reverend Clement made a quiet announcement that tea would be served in the vicarage garden, weather permitting, and that all were welcome. It was an unusual addition to the regular Sunday routine, and Miss Marple understood immediately what he intended. A formal meeting would have suggested controversy and confrontation. An informal gathering allowed for conversation without forcing positions or demanding declarations. The vicar, she reflected, was learning wisdom. A modest group assembled in the vicarage garden, where Mrs. Clement had arranged chairs and a table with tea things. The autumn sun provided enough warmth to make outdoor sitting pleasant, and the informal setting encouraged a certain relaxation that might not have been possible indoors. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and found herself in conversation with the Reverend Clement, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, de Morris, and, somewhat to her satisfaction, Mrs. Crowley, who had been gently encouraged by Mrs. Bantry to join them. Several other villagers hovered nearby, not quite part of the circle, but close enough to listen. "I'm grateful you all came," the vicar began, his manner more uncertain than his pulpit voice had been. "I felt for some days that there are matters the village needs to discuss, but I wasn't certain how to facilitate such a discussion without appearing to criticise someone who can no longer defend himself." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "the question is not whether to criticise, but whether to understand. Understanding does not require condemnation, but it does require honesty." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "I think we all know we're here to talk about Dr. Haydock, about certain discoveries that have been made since his death, questions that have arisen about his medical judgments." "Yes," de Morris said quietly, "and I want to be clear that I did not initiate this gathering with any desire to impugn Haydock's memory. But as his successor, I have a responsibility to my patients, and that responsibility includes acknowledging where previous conclusions may have been incomplete." Mrs. Crowley spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite evident nervousness. "I believe I am one of those patients whose case was handled incompletely. I do not speak from bitterness, but from a desire that others might not experience what I did." Miss Hartnell, who had positioned herself near enough to hear, interjected with characteristic directness. "Surely we're not suggesting that Dr. Haydock was negligent. The man gave 40 years of devoted service to this village." "No one is suggesting negligence," Miss Marple said calmly. "What we are recognising is that devotion and infallibility are not the same thing. Dr. Haydock served the village with genuine care and dedication, but he was human and therefore capable of error. The question is not whether he made mistakes, all physicians do, but how those mistakes were handled when they occurred." The vicar leaned forward. "Miss Marple, you've been observing this situation with your characteristic insight. Would you share your understanding of what transpired?" Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "I believe," she said, "that what occurred was not criminal but moral in nature. Dr. Haydock's greatest strength was his ability to reassure patients, to make them feel that their troubles were manageable and their fears groundless. This is a valuable gift in a physician, but over time this gift appears to have evolved into something less benign, a habit of dismissing concerns rather than investigating them thoroughly." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "The desire to avoid causing distress is admirable, but when that desire becomes a consistent pattern of minimizing legitimate symptoms, of discouraging second opinions, of advising patients to suffer quietly rather than seek further help, then it ceases to be kindness and becomes something else entirely." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Arthur and I have discussed this at length. We wanted to be reassured. We encouraged Haydock's confidence because it made us comfortable. We're as much at fault as he was. "I'm not certain fault is the most useful framework," Miss Marple said gently. "What seems to have developed was a system, neither consciously created nor maliciously intended, in which Dr. Haydock's authority removed the need for scrutiny. He was confident, the village was grateful for that confidence, and over time both parties came to believe that his judgments were beyond question." Dr. Morris spoke carefully. "I've reviewed several cases where Dr. Haydock certified diagnoses with absolute certainty, only to have subsequent developments suggest those certifications were premature. Mrs. Crowley's case, Colonel Bantry's blood pressure, Mrs. Jameson's digestive troubles, young Tommy Henderson's fever. In each instance, Dr. Haydock provided reassurance when further investigation might have been warranted." "But he believed he was right," the vicar protested. "Surely good faith matters." "It matters greatly," Miss Marple agreed. "Dr. Haydock was not deliberately negligent, but good faith does not erase consequences. Those who suffered because their concerns were dismissed, and I count Mrs. Crowley among them, experienced real harm, regardless of Dr. Haydock's intentions." Mrs. Crowley spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "I do not wish to speak ill of Dr. Haydock. He was kind to me in his fashion, but his kindness consisted of telling me my perceptions were faulty, that my symptoms were imaginary, that I was creating troubles through excessive worry. I learned to doubt myself, to suppress my concerns, to feel ashamed of needing medical attention. That shame delayed proper treatment for years." "And that," Miss Marple said, "is the heart of the matter. The wrongdoing was not in making diagnostic errors. Those are inevitable in medical practice. It was in creating an environment where patients learned to distrust their own judgment, where questioning the doctor's conclusions seemed disloyal, where seeking second opinions was actively discouraged." Colonel Bantry struck the arm of his chair lightly. "By God, she's right. When Dolly suggested we might consult a specialist, I refused because Dr. Haydock had implied such a consultation would demonstrate a lack of faith in his expertise. I chose his comfort over my wife's peace of mind." "We all did," Mrs. Bantry said softly. "We chose to be comfortable rather than vigilant. We wanted someone to know all the answers so we wouldn't have to grapple with uncertainty." The vicar looked troubled. "Then what do we do now? How do we honour Dr. Haydock's service while acknowledging these uncomfortable truths?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "We acknowledge both, the service and its limitations. We recognise that Dr. Haydock gave 40 years to this village and helped many people, but we also recognise that his methods had costs, and those costs were borne by people who trusted him absolutely. We learn from this experience without condemning the man himself." "Learn what precisely?" Miss Hartnell asked, her tone sceptical but no longer defensive. "That trust should never be absolute," Miss Marple said simply. "That authority, however well earned, does not confer infallibility. That the best service we can do for those in positions of responsibility is to maintain appropriate scrutiny rather than blind faith. That questioning is not disloyalty but prudence." Dr. Morris nodded gratefully. "And, from my perspective as Dr. Haydock's successor, it means encouraging patients to voice concerns rather than suppressing them, welcoming questions rather than discouraging them, acknowledging uncertainty rather than offering false confidence." "It also means," Mrs. Crowley added quietly, "that when someone persists in expressing concern, we listen rather than labelling them as troublesome or oversensitive. We grant them the dignity of taking their own perceptions seriously." The group sat in silence for several moments. Then the Reverend Clement spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I think what you're describing, Miss Marple, is a kind of collective awakening, an understanding that we participated in creating a situation where one man's authority went unquestioned, and that this lack of questioning had consequences we're only now beginning to understand." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Precisely so. Dr. Haydock's reputation was carefully guarded, by him certainly, but also by all of us who found comfort in his certainty. We protected that reputation because it protected our own peace of mind. but some protections become prisons, and some certainties become obstacles to truth. No accusations then, the vicar said slowly, but the truth vowed to exist. Exactly, Miss Marple confirmed. The truth offered with compassion but without evasion. Dr. Haydock was a dedicated physician who served this village well in many respects, but he was also human, fallible, and perhaps too confident in his own judgments. Both things can be true simultaneously, and acknowledging both serves the living far better than preserving only the comfortable parts of his memory. The gathering broke up gradually, people drifting away in pairs and small groups, their conversations continuing in lowered voices. Miss Marple observed that several villagers who had been listening from the periphery now moved closer to Mrs. Crowley, offering words that looked like apology or understanding. The vicar walked Miss Marple to the gate, his expression relieved. "Thank you," he said simply. "You helped us find a way to speak truth without cruelty, to acknowledge fault without condemnation." "The truth was there already, Vicar," Miss Marple said. "It simply needed permission to be voiced. Your sermon this morning provided that permission. The conversation this afternoon merely allowed people to act upon it." As she walked home through the quiet Sunday afternoon, Miss Marple reflected that the village had taken an important step, not toward vilifying Dr. Haydock, but toward understanding him more completely, toward recognizing their own complicity in maintaining a fiction of infallibility, toward learning that kindness which avoids discomfort can sometimes become a form of negligence. The truth had been allowed to exist, and that, she thought, was perhaps the best memorial de Haydock could have, not a reputation preserved in amber, but an honest reckoning that might prevent future harm. Chapter 10. When silence was no longer kind. The weeks following the gathering at the vicarage brought no dramatic changes to St. Mary Mead. No official inquiries were conducted, no formal complaints lodged, no public declarations made about Dr. Haydock's medical practice. His name remained on the memorial plaque in the church vestibule, his contributions to the village duly recorded. The funeral had been respectful, the tribute sincere, the mourning genuine. Yet something had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, in the way the village conducted itself. Miss Marple observed these changes with the quiet satisfaction of one who had helped facilitate necessary understanding without forcing confrontation. She noticed them first in small things, Mrs. Henderson taking young Tommy to Dr. Morris for what she called just to be certain examinations, no longer apologising for seeking thoroughness. Mrs. Bantry speaking openly about the Colonel's ongoing treatment, sharing information rather than guarding it as private trouble. Mrs. Crowley sitting less isolated at church functions, her presence acknowledged rather than avoided. The conversations had changed as well. When people discussed their health concerns now, they did so with less embarrassment and more directness. Questions were asked more freely. Second opinions were sought without the guilt of implied disloyalty. Dr. Morris reported to Miss Marple during a chance meeting at the post office that patients seemed more willing to describe their symptoms fully rather than minimizing them out of fear of seeming troublesome. "They're taking themselves seriously," he said with evident relief. "It makes my work both easier and more effective. I can treat what's actually wrong rather than what patients think they should mention." "And are they taking you seriously as well?" Miss Marple inquired. Dr. Morris smiled slightly. "They are, but they're also not treating my pronouncements as gospel truth. They ask questions, request explanations, want to understand their treatment options. Some of the older generation find this rather forward, but I consider it healthy. Medicine should be a collaboration between physician and patient, not a pronouncement from on high." Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crowley at the greengrocer's one afternoon in early November. The widow looked better than she had in weeks, her face less drawn, her manner more assured. "I wanted to thank you," Mrs. Crowley said quietly, drawing Miss Marple aside, "for listening when I needed to be heard, for believing me when others had taught me not to believe myself. My dear, you required no intervention from me. You had the truth already. You simply needed permission to voice it." "Perhaps. But permission matters, doesn't it? Particularly for those of us who have been taught that voicing uncomfortable truths is a form of rudeness. Mrs. Crowley paused, then added, "I've had several other women approach me since the gathering at the vicarage, quietly, privately, to share their own experiences with the Haydock. Small dismissals, symptoms attributed to nerves or imagination, reassurances that proved hollow. None of them had spoken of these things before, fearing they would seem ungrateful or disloyal. And now they speak. Now they speak, not with bitterness, but with the relief of finally being allowed to acknowledge what they experienced. It's remarkable, Miss Marple, how much lighter one feels when one's perceptions are validated rather than dismissed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The silence was meant to be kind, I think. To protect Dr. Haydock's reputation, to preserve the village's comfort, to avoid unpleasantness. But silence can be kind only when truth would serve no purpose. In this case, silence served only to perpetuate patterns that had caused harm." "When did you first suspect something was wrong?" Mrs. Crowley asked. Miss Marple considered this. Perhaps at the funeral itself, the praise was so unanimous, so carefully constructed, so determined to remember Dr. Haydock in precisely one way. When everyone agrees so completely about someone's character, it often means they've agreed not to remember certain things. The unanimity felt rehearsed rather than genuine. "You saw what we were all doing." "I saw what humans always do when confronted with complicated truths about people they wish to honour. We simplify, we edit, we create a version of the person that's easier to mourn than the actual person who lived. But the dead no longer require our protection of their reputations. The living, however, require truth." The village settled into its new patterns as autumn deepened toward winter. The Ladies' Guild met and discussed health matters with a frankness that would have seemed unseemly a month earlier. The Reverend Clement's sermons touched occasionally on themes of honest reckoning and compassionate truth-telling. Colonel Bantry, following de Morris's treatment plan, reported feelings considerably improved and spoke openly about the value of thorough medical investigation. Dr. Haydock's name was mentioned less frequently as the weeks passed, not from deliberate erasure, but from the natural process of life continuing. When he was mentioned, it was with genuine appreciation for his dedication tempered by acknowledgement of his limitations. No one spoke of him with bitterness or condemnation, but neither did anyone speak of him with the absolute certainty that had characterized the funeral tributes. He became in memory what he had been in life, a skilled physician with genuine care for his patients, but also a fallible human whose confidence sometimes exceeded his accuracy, whose desire to reassure sometimes prevented proper investigation, whose authority had been allowed to grow beyond appropriate bounds through collective acquiescence. On a cold December afternoon, Miss Marple walked past the churchyard where Dr. Haydock lay buried beside his wife. The grave was tidy, the headstone dignified, the tributes appropriate. She paused for a moment, reflecting on funerals and their purposes. The service 3 months earlier had been conducted with precision and decorated with unanimous praise. It had honoured a man the village trusted implicitly, but it had also represented a final effort to maintain a fiction of infallibility that had already begun to crack. The real funeral, Miss Marple thought, had occurred more recently, not the burial of a body, but the laying to rest of an illusion. The village had finally allowed Haydock to be remembered as he was, dedicated but imperfect, caring but fallible, authoritative but not infallible. That more honest memorial served both the dead and the living far better than the carefully constructed eulogy had done. She thought of Mrs. Crowley now receiving proper treatment and no longer apologising for her own perceptions. She thought of Colonel Bantry, whose health was improving under care that acknowledged rather than dismissed his symptoms. She thought of the various other villagers who'd begun to ask questions, to seek thoroughness, to trust themselves as well as their physician. The village had learned something valuable from Dr. Haydock's death, though not the lesson it had expected to learn at his funeral. It had learned that kindness, which avoids discomfort, can, over time, become a form of cruelty. That trust untempered by appropriate scrutiny serves neither the trusted nor those who trust, that the most difficult funerals are indeed those where honesty arrives too late, but that late honesty is still preferable to permanent evasion. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet winter afternoon, past familiar houses and familiar faces, through a village that looked unchanged on the surface but had shifted subtly in its understanding of authority, trust, and truth. Nothing official had changed. Dr. Haydock's name remained honoured. His service was still acknowledged. His grave would be tended with respect. But conversations had shifted. People listened a little longer,